what are the current things you're finding the typical company has that, the most obvious vulnerabilities that they have?
Yeah, it's a good question, and thanks for having me today. First of all, going back to your survey question, I think it's pretty interesting because I would guess that the 21% who said that they didn't have a security incident probably did, they just don't know about it. I think that's a fundamental problem we're seeing across the space. How do you actually know you had a security incident if you don't have the right tools in place? So I think it's a really interesting question. But in terms of what vulnerabilities are we seeing out there, that's a great one. Our company is all about helping large enterprises gain a better contextual understanding of what their attack surface looks like, and from a security perspective, where points of exploitation are using independent hackers all around the world. And I think the common theme that we're seeing throughout our customers is that everyone's vulnerable. Whether you're one of the largest banks in the world or you're a small startup, you all have big problems that you need to address. And without thinking outside of the box, without using modern security methodologies and techniques, you're going to be the next news headline eventually. And I mean,
are we at a point really where even to talk about being unhackable is just a fantasy? I mean, ultimately we should just accept that everyone is going to be hacked, and therefore, I guess, not retain vast amounts of extremely sensitive data or something of that kind. Or,
yeah, look, I don't believe there's such a thing as 100% secure. I don't think that exists, but we certainly can create a baseline for ourselves and that we strive towards. And I think most companies are not at that baseline. They have a lot of work to do before they get there. And Jamil probably has a lot of perspective on this coming from a lot of different organizations. First we got to get there and then figure out where is the gap. And really it's a question about risk. How much risk do we want to take by leaving some portion of our technology assets exposed to the world and open? And if it's just a matter of, state governments are really the only ones that can penetrate us in that gap, maybe that's an acceptable level of risk that we're willing to take. But we at least need to get to that level first.
Jamil, I mean, same question to you. I mean, is this goal of unhackability just a fantasy? And
yes, it's 100% a fantasy. There's no organization that can be unequivocally unhackable. I remember when I first started my career, I was still in college, and my boss, I was focused on security there, and my boss told me the only way to be to completely lock down a system is to get the device, pour cement on it, and dump it in the river. That's the only way. And it's always stuck with me. And I think certainly in this day and age, it's not possible to stop every single attack vector there is. The adversaries are too sophisticated. Our environments are too complex. The best we can do is be able to manage that risk and reduce the probability that we will be the next one.
And so, I guess we like to think that governments are capable of being so secure that as they're trusted with more data than anyone else. I mean, you've both been in the government sector. What do you see there? Is there even there the possibility of such profound encryption that you can keep stuff secret? Or
well, as a victim of the OPM breach from last year, I would say that obviously the government has quite a ways to go in that space. But I think it's just like any other industry. You have a variety of organizations and a broad spectrum in terms of who's more secure and who's less, based on the organizations that are trying to focus on this, investing in it appropriately, and the government is no different. I would say that generally speaking, certainly as you move over more into the defense space within the government, that I've seen significantly greater levels of maturity and security over there. But when you look at some of the other agencies, there's a lot to be desired.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I mean, I come from the state-sponsored hacking side at the NSA before starting Synack, and I'll tell you, it's a scary world out there, even from a government perspective, going after other government entities. But I completely agree with Jamil. I mean, I think the DoD is well positioned, well beyond a lot of the other federal agencies, but there's a ton of work to do they just don't have the right support, money, people to get them to the same maturity level as the DoD or some of the intelligence organizations.
I mean, some of the discussions, some of the stories we're all familiar with in the last few years, Snowden and so forth, I mean, they involve breaches for, allegedly high-minded motives of wanting to bring information into the public domain. I mean, typically, as you look at the corporate world, are there examples? Is it individuals deliberately on the inside breaching security, or does it tend to be just the lack of adequate security against outsiders that's the most common problem?
Well, I think more commonly we see external attackers, and that tends to be a significant threat for us, at least in terms of volume. But there's no doubt that any organization has the insider threat risk. I mean, you can look at San Francisco from a few years back where they had an insider who went rogue and caused their network to go down for, I don't know, I think it was like a week or something like that as they were trying to get the passwords for it. And insiders are extraordinarily challenging because they tend to have much greater access just by virtue of their roles than the external folks do. And so it's difficult to be able to model against them, difficult to be able to identify what their motives are, and then be able to isolate them and get them.
Yeah, because it's interesting. I mean, I've been reading around some of the recent coverage of, both I think the Ashley Madison and the Sony hacks. I mean, in both cases, it still seems like there's no general agreed view on who actually perpetrated it. Was it the government of North Korea, or was it a disgruntled insider at Sony? Was it the same, a disgruntled insider or some moral crusader that attacked Ashley Madison? I just wonder, as you guys in the industry, is there really much that we know about what actually happened in many of these attacks?
I think just the anonymous nature of the internet makes it so difficult to figure out who the culprit is in a lot of these cases. It's so easy to reroute your traffic through multiple hops and basically mask your identity. Obviously, the government has some capability to try to take historical data and match that up to new attacks and figure out who the actor might be. But even that's not foolproof. And I think we're going to continue to run into this, right, as breaches continue to occur. And then with the advent of things like you have Tor networks, which make it almost impossible to track who the person is, and then you have Bitcoin, where you can transfer money anonymously. It's making the underground hacker industry thrive in a lot of ways.
So, before we talk about specifically what advice we would give to companies and what sort of things they can do, I just want a bit of your personal stories about this to give us a flavor of this whole world. You were talking about you were involved in an offensive hacking operation for the government-sponsored hacking at some point.
Yeah, I can tell you all about it.
Yeah, what does that mean? What are you able to tell us about that? Is this a routine part of every government's armory now, to have a group of people that are trying to hack other governments and others?
Look, certainly some governments are a lot more capable than others. There's not a whole lot I can say on this topic, but we're always going to find the easiest way to get intelligence to our decision makers, to our military, and with how prolific the internet has evolved, and how much people are using it, and how other governments are talking to people in those governments, it just makes sense that we're seeing this as an important part of our intelligence apparatus.
And is it your sense that governments are typically going after other governments, or would they be going after commercial entities as well?
Yeah, I think it just depends on what their priorities are. I think you look at China as an example of a country that takes industry secrets really seriously and will spend a lot of time on going after corporations in addition to governments, while the U.S. I think is has other interests in mind.
But one of the hallmarks, whether it's...
Tell us a bit about your background as well, and this is before you ended up at Home Depot.
Sure. So I've been in security my entire career, focused on risk management. I've been in, it seems like virtually every industry: telecom, government, financial services, media and entertainment. Now I'm at retail, and a lot of the things, so I like to think that I've seen pretty much all that can be seen within this space from a vulnerability standpoint, from a response standpoint, and so forth. But going back here, one of the things that's a hallmark of a good security program is to have a red team capability, which is to say that you have people that you trust that are actually attacking your environment on an ongoing basis to be able to identify how a true adversary would actually try to penetrate your environment. And so I think to that end, you learn a tremendous amount of intelligence about your organization. You find out where some of the weak spots are, and you try to close them up before the adversaries have an opportunity to do.
And just give me a sense. I mean, how many people do you think are now employed in being friendly hackers of that kind, trying to attack other organizations, or to attack the organization that's hiring them?
Jay's probably a great person for that.
Is this tens of people, hundreds of thousands of people?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thanks for the business pitch, because that's exactly what we do. So, there is a huge supply and demand problem as it relates to cybersecurity talent. There simply are not enough people out there that are really good at the space. I mean, it's one thing to read a book and be educated on cybersecurity. It's another thing to have practical knowledge and have been in the trenches and really understand this space. The number is definitely more limited than you'd think. I think when you start to tap into more of a global workforce, that it becomes a little bit easier. But I think some of our top security talent, they don't necessarily work in a security capacity. They could be developers, they could be working back in the government space, and being able to leverage their expertise becomes really important. And that's what we're trying to do. We're taking kind of a page out of the Uber playbook. Let's take slack time away from people who have other jobs and pay them on more of an incentivized basis to uncover these security holes within our customers. And it enables us to just tap into a much more diverse community of individuals who are really hyper-motivated to find these problems.
So, so this is your main product, is to provide these services to companies.
That's right. And the other really important component of this is leveraging technology for scale. We certainly recognize that people are fundamentally important in this equation. They're the ones that think like the attackers, the bad guys, think outside of the box. And there's a lot of things that you can't automate that people can do because they just have a better understanding of the context that they're working in. But at the same time, there are repeatable tasks that we can leverage technology for in more of an automated fashion. And so, I think there was some discussion earlier around enabling humans with technology, and that's definitely our philosophy.
So Jamal, tell us, what are the rules that what's the thought process every company needs to go through to try and sort of at least deal with the most glaring risks?
So the ecosystem, the way, at least this is Jamil's point of view, the way I see it is this: it starts with a problem of one. It just takes one vulnerability, one weakness to potentially lose the game, which obviously makes it a difficult challenge. It's asymmetric. Next, you have an expanding attack surface, more technology, and since technology underpins the business, it continues to expand and grow, whether it's cloud services, mobile, social, new data centers, whatever it may be. And so that makes it more challenging because technology inherently has weaknesses. Next, you have, because we're using so much technology, the reason we're using it typically is to create some data, which is where the value typically resides. So that data continues to increase, therefore your asset value continues to increase, which then incents attackers even further to attack these organizations. And then we move to the fact that the adversaries are very calculated, whether it's nation states, organized crime, even hacktivists and so forth. They continue to up their game, and it tends to be an arm race for the defenders versus the attackers. But they don't show any signs of slowing down anytime soon. So with those four things said, it'd be great for us to just say, okay, let's lock everything down to the nth degree. The problem with that, though, is that there's no point in having a security organization if there's no business to be able to support. And because each control that we put in tends to create some level of friction and reduce the ability of the organization to do something, it creates this need for us to be able to balance the risks that we face with these adversaries with the needs of the business. So we're always walking on this tightrope to be able to identify and determine what are the best risk treatment plans for the various risks that we identify.
So I mean, if you talk about what you've been doing at Home Depot, I mean, what would be the sorts of things that you've introduced there?
Well, I mean, I think even aside from Home Depot, there's a few key areas to focus on. First off is just general security hygiene. I mean, we're talking about doing your basic vulnerability scanning to identify where your weaknesses are, doing general patching, making sure that every account that you have within your organization is authorized and the right level of privileges. That's the hygiene stuff, the motherhood and apple pie. I think as you look at the individual vertical areas, one of the most important is data devaluation. So we need to be able to understand where the sensitive data resides within our organization. It's one thing to say we're going to lock down every single thing under the sun, but for any meaningful size organization, it's virtually impossible to do that. So you need to figure out where the value actually resides and then put your controls as close to that source of value as possible. Whether it's encryption, masking, obfuscation, or quite simply data elimination. Every organization I've worked for has had a tremendous amount of data that there's just no point for us to even have, whether it's social security numbers, address, whatever it might be, date of birth, things like that. So that's one vertical. The other one is the access management. Every time an adversary breaks into an organization, the first thing they're going to try to do is escalate their privileges and then move laterally throughout the environment. If you're able to have a good access management program, you're able to severely limit their ability to be able to do that. And then the final one, and I think this is becoming much, much more important in today's day and age versus back in the day, is detection and response. We know, given the size of our organizations and all the technology and all the complexity, that there's no way for us to stop every single attack that's out there. That's probably why you see that breach number that's so high. But what we can do is be able to have a very strong ability to be able to identify unusual behavior within our environment, such that as soon as we identify something's awry, we can respond to it and eliminate it from the environment as quickly as possible. And I think in today's day and age, it's vital that organizations have a strong focus in this area.
And what are the most common mistakes that you come across?
I mean, we're looking at the vulnerability landscape more from a technical perspective, but of course, one of the largest vulnerabilities that every organization has are their people, right? Phishing attacks are probably one of the most successful ways of getting inside of a corporate network or environment, and it's not going to get better anytime soon. It's so difficult to defend against that type of attack. A lot of
phishing being,
you know, a malicious email being sent to one of the users in your organization. It might contain a piece of malware or a link that has malware embedded within a web page, and then ultimately compromising that internal machine and enabling someone to swim laterally, which is why, you know, locking down that network and having robust access management controls is so important. But it really starts from education of the user base, and educating an entire large corporation is very difficult, right? Well, how do you know what a bad email is from a good email? There's some technology companies that are trying to identify these spear phishing attacks and campaigns a little bit more programmatically, and get ahead of those problems. But it's going to continue to be one of the most difficult things to defend against. You know, we commonly see programming issues as the biggest weak spot. You know, developers just not being well educated on best security practices, and as a result of that, a lot of the applications being left wide open, enabling an adversary or a bad actor to you know, to compromise the integrity of that application. And until developers start learning security from the ground up and not baking it in later, we're going to continue to see those problems as well.
Does the whole discussion we had earlier about moving towards a workforce that are, you know, more and more people doing gigs and so forth, which obviously software is an area where that is growing quite fast. I mean, to what extent is that emerging as an area of vulnerability that you're using people outside the company?
I'm sorry, from a software development standpoint?
Well, we heard earlier that a lot of companies are now using outsourced labor, particularly to do programming. And
Sure.
so forth. I mean, is Have you seen that become a source of vulnerability?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think those same organizations that perform that work need to be just as educated from a security standpoint as your own internal developers. The accountability now, though, is shifted from you to them, but at the same time, you're the one that's ultimately at risk. And so I think ensuring that these outsourced agencies take security seriously and are performing vulnerability scans and testing in a really robust way before it's deployed into your environment, I think that becomes really important before you deploy anything into production.
It's a huge problem. I mean, third parties, whether they're freelance workers or it's another organization that you do business with, if you look at the top 10 list of the largest hacks of all time, many of them are going to originate from those third parties, and it's extraordinarily difficult because it all boils down to trust. You have to be able to trust them to be able to get their work done, but at the same time, you have to be able to have meaningful controls in place so that these folks don't have unfettered access to your entire environment. I had a situation in one of my previous employers where we were going through an M&A deal and a phishing attack occurred, and what ended up happening was our lead legal organization that was advising us on the deal was compromised, and as a result of that, they used that trust to be able to send phishing emails to a handful of key executives who were working specifically on this deal. Because it came from this organization and a specific person that they trusted, they were working day in and day out with, they all clicked on the link and they all were infected as a result. So it's easier sometimes if it's a third party that's just providing certain less valuable resources and so forth. But it's difficult, if not impossible, to completely eliminate that threat from the entire organization. And that's why, from a security perspective, we call it defense in depth, where we put in a variety of controls at different layers. So if any one of those layers is compromised, we still have a backstop somewhere else. And at the end of the day, it goes back to that detection and response, where if everything fails, then you have that ability to be able to defend against it.
I guess one of the most sort of worrying sorts of hack from a consumer perspective is, if the credit card data is being accessed. Is that an area where there's been any progress in being able to figure out how to keep that really secure?
I think there's been a lot of you're talking about payment transactions specifically, right? I think there's been a lot of progress there. I mean, everything from, if you talk about card present transactions, which are the transactions if you actually have your credit card in your hand and you go into the store and swipe, we've got EMV technology there, which helps protect that. To the online transactions and the encryption of the actual payment channel itself. There's been a tremendous amount of innovation in that area, and the organizations that are doing it right can get to a point where that entire transaction is encrypted from start to finish, which significantly reduces the likelihood of a potential breach.
I think you're also seeing a lot of companies moving away from storage of that data to just it being completely transactional, and then the data being gone, so that if a breach occurs, none of that data is anywhere to compromise.
As you peer forward a few years, I mean, are there going to be are there any areas where you could see sort of radically different approaches coming in that might make it possible to be much more secure in biometric based, or something that's just completely out of the box?
Yeah, I think biometrics are really interesting. I mean, we're seeing iPhones now taking advantage of that technology, so that's become pretty mainstream. But the scary thing about biometric data becoming a mechanism to secure a device is that if that data becomes compromised, we have no mechanism to change it because it's part of us, right? And so it begs the question is, how mainstream should that actually be, and how much should we be relying on that to protect our devices and applications and software? I think we're going to continue to see a lot of innovation and the industry evolve as a whole. I see there's a lot of initiatives to re-architect how network communications are currently conducted using more trusted channels. Encryption is getting better and better. I mean, we have this whole iPhone debate with the FBI recently. Encryption has gotten so good that the government can't even crack it, so they're asking the technology companies to go insert backdoors.
So what's it, I mean, let's talk about that for a second. So what is really at stake for you in that argument? Because it's so striking how the software industry has all come behind Apple and saying this is, in a case where you would think that because it's a terrorist incident of that type, the PR department must be saying, don't fight. This is not the case to be making a stand over.
I think it's a little bit of a paradigm shift, right? We're not talking about privacy anymore in this case. We're talking about enabling technology companies to do everything they possibly can to secure the integrity of the data on these devices, even from, one, from your brother and sister from getting into your phone, but two, from a state government getting into that same data. And I think as soon as we start talking about inserting mechanisms to compromise that data using a backdoor or other mechanism, using additional software, that same mechanism is going to get into the wrong hands eventually. And it's going to put us all at risk. It'll put state secrets at risk. It'll put our decision makers at risk. They all use iPhones, BlackBerries, whatever it might be. And we have to really weigh the consequences of doing this. I'm obviously, regardless of the fact that I come from a government counterterrorism background, I'm actually in Apple's camp. I believe that they're doing the right thing, kind of holding, standing up for the government and these requests. So,
do you agree?
Whether or not you trust the government, I certainly don't trust backdoors because, to Jay's point, it's notorious. I mean, there's countless times that we've seen backdoors being created, whether authorized or not, where the bad guys are able to identify them and then utilize them to their own ends. So I fundamentally, from a security perspective, disagree with the creation of any backdoors into any technology.
So let's go to the audience. Anyone got a question? We've got a gentleman down the front here. The microphone will...
Doesn't China have a backdoor for iPhones in China?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I haven't heard of it.
Yeah, I don't believe Apple is inserted. I think, given that everything traverses through China's Great Wall, firewall, there is an ability to potentially decrypt the data that's traversing outside of the device. But in terms of actually having a backdoor, in the software baked in, I don't believe Apple currently has that. But it's a good question.
There was someone in the middle there. Yeah, lady with a hand up there.
Hi, Elizabeth Cornell. I'm with the Strategic Account Management Association. In terms of the protection that companies provide consumers, and when you think of over 8 million people a year having their identity stolen, it seems to me there hasn't been a whole lot of innovation because in order to do business, to open accounts online, we're constantly asked for our social security number and our birth date. And then the identity theft experts say, don't give out your social security number. So what are companies doing so that we don't have to give out our private information to open accounts?
Yeah. Go ahead.
That's really a company by company decision in terms of what kind of information they need from the various consumers. It goes back to what I was saying before, that the data elimination aspect is really critical because a lot of times these organizations don't actually need that type of information to be able to do whatever they need to do.
Because there seems to have just been a culture of just ask people everything and not really think about whether or not you need it.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many forms I've seen that have your social security number as your identifier, where it could just be some randomized number. It doesn't have to be associated back to the individual. And it's frustrating, but at the same time, those decisions sometimes have been made historically, and so it just goes on in perpetuity. There are a lot of technologies that organizations can put in place to be able to reduce the likelihood that these types of crimes will occur. But I'll tell you this, whether it's putting your information into a website and you can look at it from the corporate standpoint, but as individuals, and I think this goes back to Jay's point about education, a lot of times we practice unsafe behaviors on the internet itself, on our own time, on our own computers at home. And a lot of the identity theft that I've seen in the past has actually been driven a lot by that, where your information is compromised because you click on a link for your personal email, your own system your own laptop or whatever is compromised, and then it goes from there. Anyway, make a long story short, I think there's a lot of factors at play here, but there are technologies that can help reduce that. And we really need to just get businesses to understand that this is an important topic and that we need to put the appropriate controls in place to be able to reduce that risk.
I actually believe as a consumer, I just assume my identity is going to be stolen. There's no way around it. You're giving your information to too many people. You don't know what they're doing to secure that data. So if you have that assumption in mind, and you take appropriate precautions by monitoring your credit reports, by looking through your bank statements, and then getting ahead of it, you're going to be much better off because it's the Home Depot could be the most big company in the world, but you're eventually going to give your information to someone else.
Because that's a big statement. I certainly have friends that go to China a lot that just don't take a phone to China with them. I mean, is that a rule that you would stick with?
Yeah, I mean, I think China does a pretty good job at hacking your device when you walk into the country, and that's well known. So I think just assume that's another case of where you should make that assumption. Walking in the door, take a different device with you.
So what else should we assume besides you're going to have your identity taken and you're going to be hacked in China? Are there? I mean,
the world's going to end. I don't know.
What does it mean? But for you, practically, I mean, how do you? I mean, that's. If you're really assuming your identity is being stolen, I mean, how does that alter your behavior?
I think it just makes me more aware, right? Aware of my accounts, my.
So you're just checking everything all the time.
I employ other services that monitor those accounts for me. So my credit reports. Use of my social security number, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of services out there that will do that, and most likely one of you have interfaced with a company that has been hacked at this point, and they're providing free credit monitoring for you, so just take advantage of that.
Do you have any similar advice? Or?
I tend to view it similarly to Jay. Having been a victim of any number of compromises, and I know my information's out there everywhere. I mean, the government one recently, the OPM one, I've gone through security clearance, and I'm sure you were hit by that one too. And so virtually every single facet of my life is out there, probably with China. At least it wasn't anonymous. That's only good news for that one. But yeah, I just tend to assume that my information's out there, and I think the credit card companies have done a good job because there's zero liability for card fraud and things like that. And if you put in place some of these credit monitoring services, it puts you in the best position possible. I think the worst position possible is assume that your information is always going to be protected and it's never going to get out there. Then you tend to, that position of naivete leads you down a path where you could potentially be burned in the future.
Yeah, a gentleman at the front here, and then someone at the back, I think.
Yeah, Phil Reeves from Stratasys. Very simplistic question, but I can't think of two better people to ask, so hopefully I can give the answer back to our IT people. Passwords. Statistically, is it better to just leave passwords as they are, as most banks do, or do what our IT people do, which is change them every 4 months, and then everybody ends up writing them down or making them incredibly simplistic? So which way?
I think you might have better perspective on this, but I think either way you go, you need to have another authentication mechanism in place. So two-factor authentication is, I think, critical for any organization. You can't passwords just don't make sense anymore. I can't believe we still use them for so many things. So having another factor of some sort, whether that is a biometric identifier, whether that's a PKI token or something to that extent, and we're seeing that more and more. I think that's essential today. And so password policy, changing passwords is important to an extent, but that shouldn't be the only way in the door.
I would agree with that. There was a study done by Microsoft a couple of years back where they assessed the productivity impact of users putting in their password throughout the year, just domestically, and the number they came up with, it was like it was like $65 billion in lost productivity just from passwords alone. I don't know how thorough they were in their analysis there or not, but I think without a doubt, a lot of organizations go too far on that. And there's been a lot of studies done that demonstrate that if you go beyond 8 characters and you go beyond a 30-day rotation or a 60-day rotation, that users, the propensity is for them to move and start writing their passwords down, and which actually creates a greater risk for you. But I think that you have to rotate them to some degree. I've seen this happen multiple times where passwords stay static. There was one case where I was in an organization, the password had been static since 1996. I mean, I was in high school. And so it needs to change more frequently than that, obviously. But when they're static for a long time, then it's easy for an adversary eventually to be able to get that password and then move throughout the organization. My philosophy is try to keep it simple. If it's on a 90-day or 120-day basis, that's sufficient as long as you have 8 characters. But I think to Jay's point, if you drive technologies such as two-factor authentication and so forth, that's by far the best. And even your bank is going to use that to a certain degree as well. Most major banks have started to do that now for consumers.
There's someone at the back there.
I'm Jason Park from Allstate. So do you guys think that it's possible for us to get to a truly universal standard for identification and authentication, and what would that take to get there?
Oh, gosh. That would be amazing if it could happen. When I was at a previous organization, we took a stab at this actually, because given the network and given where we were in the marketplace, it was a good opportunity. We had a good opportunity potentially to be able to create a universal, unified identity. We work with the DMVs across the country and a variety of other organizations. There are a lot of hurdles to actually achieving that, both from a technical complexity standpoint as well as the current concerns around Big Brother. As you can imagine, if there was one universal identity that everyone could have, that if you were able to, as an adversary, if you were able to get access to that, oh my gosh, your level of control and visibility would be limitless.
But you look at, I mean, India has got this universal identification scheme that seems to, I mean, do you think that's full of holes, probably, when it comes down to it? Or?
I can't go into detail about that, but I have a variety of concerns related to that.
I think it's kind of weighing that privacy versus security balance, right? On one hand, you want something that's going to be easy for users to implement and to use, and on the other hand, they don't want to be tracked, and so where do you find that balance in between the two? And we continue to see that like across the security industry, privacy versus security.
Yeah, lady at the front here. There's a microphone will come to you.
Thank you very much. I'm Nell Minnow. Given the fact that corporations are obligated to disclose material risks and material information to their investors, what do you think investors need to know about the procedures and the history of attacks that companies have?
I think it's maybe not as critical to know the history, but what their security posture looks like today. I think that's the real question, right? Because you can have had a lot of problems in the past, and that might not be indicative of where you are, because you could be better because you've learned from those mistakes.
And what requirements are there around disclosure on that today?
Oh, there's a variety of disclosure requirements. You probably know them by heart.
It really depends on the state. They're different in California versus Massachusetts versus Georgia, wherever it may be. But in certain states, they're very, very stringent in terms of disclosure. So to answer your question, what I would say is it's going to be impossible to list out all of the controls you have in an organization and the effectiveness therein. And quite frankly, from a security perspective, I'm not sure that I would want everyone to know that, because it can fall into the wrong hands and they might know where they should focus their efforts. That said, I think there are compliance regimes out there that provide meaningful guidance and insight into how effective the organization is doing from a security standpoint. So whether it's PCI or SOX and things like that, as long as you're meeting those compliance requirements and you know that there's enough rigor going behind the analysis and assurance that those controls are in place, I believe that's sufficient for those reports.
I mean, insurance companies are having that same problem, right? Because cyber risk insurance is becoming almost a necessity at every large company. And how do you ultimately measure the risk associated with writing a policy for another organization? Do you go with these compliance standards? Is that enough, or is there another way to measure it? And there's a lot of companies trying to get into that space to help these insurers just understand what risk they're taking on by insuring.
So how are they doing it at the moment, the insurer?
They're going like this. I don't know. I think that they certainly they have a checklist of items that they look at from a compliance standpoint. They're starting to think a little bit more outside of the box and look at other indicators. There's some companies that will show indicators of breach by looking at passive data, and they're working in conjunction with these insurers. But I think that's the process behind that is going to evolve drastically over the next couple of years. So I think we're going to see a lot of innovation in that space.
Changed a lot just in the past year alone. I mean, it used to be to be able to go through your insurance questionnaires. It was 10 questions, super high level, and I always thought, how the heck do they know any more about my organization and whether it's secure or not based on this questionnaire? But as of late, they've really amped it up, and I think to Jay's point, they're going to everything from technological solutions in terms of monitoring the effectiveness of your controls and so forth, to doing deep dives in terms of interviews and questionnaires and so forth with the security leadership of each one of these organizations. And it also depends on how much you're looking to try to insure against.
We got one more question? Yeah, in the middle there. The mic will come to you.
Steve Schnittman, Bristol Myers. What do you think the risk is to the power grid and other infrastructure things such as air traffic control? Are we doing what we should be doing? Because I worry that state governments and others, and these power companies can't afford the appropriate, or don't want to, or don't know what they need.
It's a great question. I just gave a talk last week at the RSA Security Conference in San Francisco on critical infrastructure. And we put out an independent survey to understand the sentiment within these organizations from the people that actually manage security. And as you can imagine, at very small water utilities and small energy companies, they don't even have a security organization. They're relying on ops people to make sure that everything is secure. We identified huge gaps in network segmentation, so being able to swim from a corporate network to a process control system, which ultimately controls the signals going into the power grid and so forth. There are so many problems with our critical infrastructure today. The government is certainly trying to make strides towards putting standards in place, but it's going to take a really long time, I think, for us to get to a place where we feel comfortable. I hate to paint a doomsday scenario, but it's scary right now. I think we have a lot of work to do in that space.
Great. Well, I'd just like to end by asking each of you, what's your number one piece of advice to all these people from business here as they think about cybersecurity?
I think just changing your mindset from a defensive standpoint to more of an offensive mindset, and thinking like the adversary would, and putting yourself in their shoes and saying, if I was to attack my own organization, where would I start? And how can I ultimately gain that perspective, that understanding? I think that will put you leaps, bounds ahead of most organizations who are strictly just trying to lock down systems without having that mentality.
I think first you have to try to focus on what we're trying to achieve here, but the opposite of it, which is to assume you're breached. I think looking through that lens puts you in a much, much better position to be able to defend against the attacker. I think the other most important thing is focus on just the basic blocking and tackling. I can't tell you how many security events that I've seen in my career that all stem from just, oh, we should have done that. That's just a basic access control measure, or oh, this data was sitting out there and we had no idea about it. Or there's this vulnerability that should have been patched 10 years ago that they exploited to get into the environment. There's a lot of sexy tools out there and great technology and a lot of folks willing to sell you that stuff. But if you focus on the basic blocking and tackling, you're gonna eliminate 95% of the attack vectors that you have within your organization. And quite frankly, yourself on a personal level.
Well, this has been a fascinating and, I say, somewhat disturbing conversation. I'd like to thank both Jay and Jamil for joining us this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.